What a nice welcome. Thank you. They told me I had to speak here less than a half hour, and I said I'll do my best, but if it goes past an hour and a half, I got to get my notes back in shape here. I want to start off by bringing a greeting from Robert Welch's son. Robert Welch's son, named Hillard, has always been known to everybody that's close to him as Hid, H-I-D. And he and I became good friends for a while. I used to take an afternoon off every summer and go down to Cape Cod where he lived. And we'd play 9 holes of golf, and if anybody was playing along with us, they knew that we didn't know how to play golf. But Hidden and his wife sold their place in Cape Cod and moved up to near where I live, and we get together for lunch every once in a while now. It's quite a delight. So he asked me to give his greeting to everybody and to thank you all for your steadfastness and loyalty to the society. Some of my notes are pretty small here, so I put the spectacles back on. You know, we live at a time when a lot of things that are kind of backwards. You know, we don't like to hear that there are people who don't know which gender they are, but they're out marching for women's rights, right? I was asked recently, if you rob a bank in a sanctuary city, is it just an undocumented withdrawal? Well, on and on you can go, but there's a lot of that kind of thing that's going on, and we have to keep a sense of humor, don't we? Right? Now, those of you who have read my book or heard Marty talking about it know that my first encounter with Robert Welch occurred in 1962. That was the year my letter thanking William Buckley for his nasty attack on the JBS leader appeared in National Review magazine. It took a while, but thanks to some persistent JBS members, I eventually woke up. I joined the society, and I've never turned back. So my beginning with Robert Welch was a bit rocky, but it got better. And I have lots of memories, some of which I'm delighted to share with you. I think there's a little bit of a lesson there. If you know somebody who is an activist, it doesn't matter what he's active for, that's the person you want to get in the Birch Society, right? And sometimes you will find that somebody who's been an enemy of the Birch Society will become one of the best members. Gary Allen, who many of you remember, he had the same kind of beginning that I did. He scoffed at a neighbor who was spouting Birch ideas, and he eventually read the books the guy gave him and said, okay, you win, how do I join? You know, so it can happen. I remember going to a recruiting meeting in 1963 when a 30-minute Robert Welch film was shown. I bought some books, went home, started reading. Soon I obtained a copy of The Politician, as Marty has mentioned, his critical biography of President Eisenhower. When I read through that, my respect for Robert Welch and my concern for my country really, really took over. In 1964, I remember watching Robert Welch being interviewed on NBC's Meet the Press. The moderator back then was a fair-minded individual named Lawrence Spivak. Forced to defend himself by several of the panelists, Mr. Welch had little opportunity to get the JBS message across. One of the interrogators, a rising star in the television news business named Frank McGee, actually literally snarled at Robert Welch, and then he went and died. I don't know that it was exactly related, but it may have been, right? When I joined the society in 1964, and I met some of the veterans even then, I remember thinking I'd never catch up to those people. They had read so many books and they knew so much about what was really going on. One of the interrogators, so I decided to do my best. The truth is, I've never caught up, right? But reading the bulletin was always a joy. I liked Robert Welch's writing style, and I knew some who didn't, even though they greatly appreciated what he had written and what he had accomplished. At the 10th anniversary, it was held in Indianapolis, where the society was actually formed. One of the speakers turned to Robert Welch and said, "By the way, Bob, have you ever joined the John Birch Society?" He jumped up from his place, ran over, grabbed the microphone, and said, "No, I've always been more effective on the outside." All the activity we undertook early in the society after I had joined earned my wife and me an invitation to a private dinner meeting for the council and about 30 other guests in Boston. This was late 1965. The council had met during the day, and with their business over, it was time to relax. So this was my first time I was in the same room with Mr. Welch, and after meeting him and many of the council members, I began to appreciate even more what the society meant for the future. It seemed to me that being with him and the council members was a bit like being with royalty, right? I should mention, too, that one of the men that I sat with at the dinner at that meeting was a fellow named Fred Koch. Fred Koch has two sons who have not been friends of the John Birch Society. And we could go over that, but the local activity we generated led to a request that I join the staff. So after having a meeting with the fellow who wanted to hire me for the society, I went home and I told my wife I was going to quit my electronics job and go to work for the John Birch Society. And she looked at me and said, "Do they pay?" I told her we'd be okay, and we have been okay all these years. About 10 years later, I was with Mr. Welch at a press conference, and an inquisitive reporter asked him if he could put a date on the lowest point in the society's history. Without too much hesitation, he said it occurred during the middle of the 1966, when accumulated smears had taken a severe toll. The summer of '66, I scratched my head. I gulped. Later, I told him that his pointing to mid-'66 as the low point in the history of the society certainly got my attention, because I had joined his staff on August 1st, 1966. And with his response and that infectious Welsh smile, he said, "I told you it was our low point." In November 1966, Robert Welch published his essay entitled "The Truth in Time." If you've never read that, go back and read it and realize 1966. For me, it contained a sentence that, other than some of my favorite scripture passages, was the most profound statement I have ever heard or read. He wrote in that, "But the communist movement is only a tool of the total conspiracy." That explanation and that sentence explained the likes of Dean Rusk and Robert McNamara, Henry Cabot Lodge, Averell Harriman, and David Rockefeller. And they weren't communists. They were Communist Party superiors. That statement would in time explain Henry Kissinger and a host of others. Robert Welch lived in Belmont, Massachusetts, on a street called Fletcher Road, and 4 houses up the street from his home was Henry Kissinger's home. Interesting that they should be so close. That's the only closeness they ever enjoyed. These people weren't communists and never had been. They were insiders. We now call it the deep state. I like that. I like that. That's a change from insiders, but insiders says it, deep state says it. They are the cores of a great conspiracy aimed at our country and our civilization. And there were plenty of would-be insiders doing their work for them. At the 10th anniversary of the society, One of the speakers turned to Mr. Welch. Oh, I've already talked about this. By the way, Bob, have you ever joined? If you were over at the headquarters building, you could see the actual membership application framed. It's right next to the two lavatories, and I should have left that out. But anyhow, I think there were 4 men who came with a check for $1,000 immediately to pay for his life membership, right? And one of them was Ben McMillan from St. Louis, who, what are we doing? Who at the founding meeting wrote out a check and handed it to Robert Welch at the end of his 17-hour speech and said, Bob, I guess we're in business. Here's the way to get started. And Ben McMillan was a wonderful member of the council and a good friend to all the Birchers. He wrote on his application, on Robert Welch's application, at the bottom, somebody has to endorse it, as you know, and he wrote first member. And that's hanging on the wall at the headquarters building. You can see it. He was the first member. The Welch 10th anniversary speech contained his customary wisdom as he reviewed past accomplishments. And the thing that two things struck me at that time. First, he recounted numerous successes and made us all proud of whatever we had contributed toward achieving them. But he added that our greatest accomplishment had consisted of simply staying alive, right? And there was a lot of thought that went into that line, I'm sure. That brought home to me the fact that the leadership he had provided and the foresight he had woven into the Society's foundation should never be taken for granted. With all the venom that had been directed at the Society, it was indeed a huge accomplishment to have stayed alive. I've been reminded of that with the attack on Judge Kavanaugh, right? Some of the same tactics, but in a much more condensed form, have been used. And there are people who say, this is unfair, you shouldn't do this. Well, we ought to write letters to them and say, yeah, you're right, it wasn't fair, and it's not been fair for the John Birch Society either, right? The Welch 10th anniversary speech contained his customary wisdom as he reviewed past accomplishments and plans for the future. The second point he made, the one that he stressed many more times in the months ahead, was that the Society was feared by its enemies more for its potential than its many accomplishments. He made all of us at that gathering more determined to realize that potential. Let me add here that the potential of this organization for exposing a foul conspiracy and bringing back true Americanism is still waiting to be fully accomplished. A few years later, I met Mr. and Mrs. Welch at the airport in Boston as we waited to board a plane to go to California for one of the council members' meetings. We chatted beforehand, and when time came to board, they went into the first-class cabin, and I went to the back, certainly glad I hadn't big-timed it and ordered a first-class seat for myself. Midway through the near-empty flight, who should come back to sit with me but Robert Welch? He asked me what I was reading. He spent about an hour regaling me with his insights about a wide range of topics. That was an extra special hour, believe me. Somewhere in the mid-1970s, I was given the honor of speaking at a council dinner. He was the MC of the program, and he introduced me as follows. Ladies and gentlemen, our next speaker is a young fellow named Jack McManus. I confess to not having the foggiest idea about what he will say. Moreover, I expect that neither does he have any idea about what he will say. And even worse, I'm sure that when he finishes, neither will you have any idea about it. And then he handed it, who's clapping back there? I don't want to hear. I learned early that if you wanted to raise his ire to the stratosphere, make a mistake in grammar, right? Even worse, use a foreign language phrase incorrectly, right? On another council dinner occasion, with him sitting at his usual spot immediately to the right of the podium, I chided the audience, some of whom were busily buying dried food and saving up silver coins, building a cabin in the woods. And I said to them, you're planning to lose, and you should stop doing that. I said, you should be planning to win. He was nodding his head, right? Then I added, let me tell you what I'm going to do when we win. I'm going to buy a ticket on one of those around-the-world slow freighters and use the time to read all the books he thinks I've read. He laughed very loudly. That was fun. When 1976 arrived, we told him about a fellow we had just heard of who had rented a King George III costume and then showed up at patriotic gatherings. "Who are you?" said the speaker at the rostrum, "and what are you doing here?" And the man said, "I'm King George III, and I've come back to ask modern-day Americans a question." "What's your question?" "How do you like taxation with representation?" That got another laugh out of the man we affectionately referred to as the boss. But it also prompted an immediate suggestion from him that we find that King George outfit and pull off the stunt at the next council dinner. Thank goodness it was only 10 days away and there wasn't time. You're right if you expect that I might have been King George for the day. After one of his routine meetings at the office, I asked him if I could borrow a book from his library. He immediately said no. Somewhat chagrined, I promised that I'd return it. He said, "Oh, Jack, how do you think I got all those books?" With a huge smile, he then okayed the loan, as long as I left my name, the book title, and a date on a piece of paper in the slot where it had been sitting. I see where everybody has at your place a photo of Robert Welch and a little statement out of his book, The Romance of Education. I can justifiably take some credit for that being published, because I was with him on one occasion and he said something and I interjected and I said, of course, I said, knowledge is the discovery of ignorance. And he said, say that again. And he wrote it down on his pad that he always had handy. He said, you know, it took me a whole book to say what you've said in 6 words. I said, I know you wrote a book about education. He said, yeah, it's right up there on the shelf. I said, may I borrow it? He said, you'll bring it back? I said, yes, I will. So I brought it home, I read it, I was fascinated by it. It's one of my favorite books of all time. And I got my wife to read it, and she loved it as well. Jack, you gotta get him to publish this book, The Romance of Education, which eventually did happen, and I'm certainly glad to have had a hand in that. On one occasion, when he had sent for me to come up to his upstairs office, I was downstairs. He used a word which, like numerous other words in our language, exists only in the negative sense. I don't recall what that particular word was on that occasion, but I remarked that there was no positive companion word. What are you talking about, he said. I explained with a few examples. I said, you can refer to somebody as being uncouth, but you never say he's couth. He started looking. He says, I said, how about kempt? You never see anybody saying you're kempt, but you can be unkempt, right? Now he was interested. He said, tell me some more. Right? So I offered discombobulated. Right? If you know a neat person, do you say he's combobulated? Of course not. he started writing down these ever-present examples on his pad. I then offered, I said, machinery can be dismantled, but it was never mantled in the first place. Right? He loved that kind of thing. I asked if he wanted to become a member of my small paper organization called the Society for the Restoration of Lost Positives. I said, there are no dues like the organization you founded. This was fun in a busy day, and he thanked me for the break in the usual discussion of far, far more interesting and important matters. He never joined my Society for the Restoration of Lost Positives. But in the next bulletin, he wrote about his good friend, the governor of New Hampshire, who was a member of the John Birch Society, a man named Meldrum Thompson, wonderful man. He described Governor Thompson in the bulletin of the John Birch Society as one of the most shoveled men he had ever had the pleasure of knowing. I had created a monster. I hoped at that point that Governor Thompson would approve. I'm sure he did. I never asked him about it. Where are we here? One of my favorite stories about him demonstrated his intense focus on the Society's work. He would every morning read through his daily newspaper, and one morning, after munching down a small breakfast at his desk, he burst out of his office and angrily complained to the secretaries about the incompetence of the newspaper. "What's the matter?" they asked. Well, it turned out that one of Boston's sports teams was involved in season and in playoffs. And the story about the game, therefore, started on page 1. If it hadn't been there, he never would have even read it. But he got interested in it, started reading it, and he even turned to the interior pages to finish off reading the story. So what bothered him? Well, he told the people in the office, I wasn't there, the girls told me about it. He said, I read that whole story and they never told me what game they were playing. He obviously didn't know that the Red Sox were a baseball team, the Celtics were a basketball team, and so on. He was so committed to the struggle for freedom. Whenever someone came to see him that he didn't know very well, he would have somebody in the office show the person around our 3 buildings. We had 3 buildings in Belmont, right? And then sit in when they came back and met with Robert Welch. He wanted to be sure that no one would leave and tell the world he'd said something he never said. So we always had one of us in at the meeting, right, to verify that he hadn't said that. You know? But it made for some interesting listening for me, although others among the staff were usually asked to be the third party. He would, on occasion, ask somebody to spell his name, especially if it was a European name, and then he would proceed to tell them which part of that particular country his family had come from, even a portion of it that nobody had ever heard of. It was fascinating to listen, and he was always correct. The person would nod his head, yeah, I remember that now. I remember what you just said about my family. And all he did all of that just from the spelling of the word, of the man's last name. After he launched the Support Your Local Police program, he concluded that the threat of federal centralization of police power deserved attention. So he added the phrase, and keep them independent, to the already famous slogan. What isn't well known is that no slogan was ever developed by Robert Welch in the spur of a moment. He would literally spend an entire weekend writing down various combinations of words for a slogan before he made the final decision. And once he had made that decision, that was it. No changes. In the late 1970s, my longtime colleague and close friend, Tom Hill, who was named the first president of the John Birch Society, right, announced his engagement to Rebecca Buffington, the daughter of a council member, a farmer from Iowa. Tom, who was in the midst of a very long time serving Robert Welch as his top assistant, had protested on numerous occasions that he was a confirmed bachelor. But this was about to end. My wife and I hosted an engagement party to which we invited the Welches. I made sure he knew that the guest list included only the top executives at the Belmont headquarters, and there would be no surprises. I was keenly aware that he would never go anywhere if he was expected to recruit Aunt Tilly, Uncle Fred, or someone's know-it-all college kid. So he and Mrs. Welch came, and that was the only time I had the pleasure of having them in my home. As the years wore on, we could see that he was slowing down. He would frequently agonize over not being able to remember someone's name or the name of a city where he had been. He turned over most of the writing of the bulletin to others, but he stayed on top of everything that was going on. In March of 1983, he stepped down by stepping up. Larry McDonald was named chairman. Robert Welch was named founder and chairman emeritus. And Tom Hill was named president. He never wanted to be labeled anything but founder, but the new title explained the situation. He wrote about this development in the April 1983 bulletin, noting that newspaper reports about it were fairly accurate except for the inference that I had packed my bags and was heading for the Azores. He announced rather forcefully that retirement for me is out of the question, and that he would always be on hand to offer all the advice and support the new leaders might want. Also that he had no intention of wasting my future, he said, on giddy pastimes. For those of us who were close to him and for members everywhere, it was a sad realization that age had caught up with Robert Welch. But he could still be found at his office every day, and most nights. As you know, Larry McDonald disappeared aboard KAL-007 that was attacked by a Soviet fighter plane, less than 6 months after Robert Welch had appointed him to be the head of the society. As president, Tom Hill capably directed operations with Mr. Welch, though in declining health, certainly at his side. Then came the 25th anniversary celebration in Indianapolis, where he traveled to literally say goodbye. It would be his last public appearance. When he was introduced, the applause was immense and long. Everyone in the room knew he was failing, but he was able to give his 4-sentence speech to that hushed audience. What he said was, "Friends and fellow Birchers, you have accomplished so much. But there is more, much more to be done if we are to save our country and civilization as we know it. Thank you for all you have done and will be doing in this epic undertaking, and God be with you till we meet again." I doubt that there was a dry eye in the place. Certainly mine weren't. And the applause was sustained and resounding. A few weeks later, I remember stopping at Mr. Welch's office as I was about to head home to celebrate Christmas. We chatted briefly, wished each other a happy Christmas, and off I went. A few days after Christmas, he suffered a crippling stroke and was rushed to the hospital. There for about a month, and then off to a convalescent home for almost a full year. He never returned to his desk. The stroke had impacted his ability to speak, and whenever any of us would visit him, it was a one-way conversation. He could hear and could certainly understand, but he could not respond, other than nodding his head or smiling or whatever. He was never in any condition to leave that nursing home. I thought frequently of that fantastic mind being trapped in silence in that body. Toward the end of 1984, my visits would find him in bed, and I would hold his hand, tell him what was happening, say a few prayers. His grip was amazingly firm right till the end. I didn't want to leave. He didn't want me to leave. There were many times when my visit on the way home became extended and I was a bit late for dinner. Like all of you, I owed him plenty, and I gladly stayed with him on many occasions. He passed away on January 6th, 1985. Even though no one was surprised when the end came, we took it hard. We owed him so much. I think I was the last person to see him alive. If Robert Welch were here today, he would let you know, with humor and insight and love, how much he respected every member of the John Birch Society. He would thank all of you for what you have done and will do in the great struggle for freedom that brought us together. And he would, as he frequently did, refer collectively to all who have ever been faithful members as the finest body of men and women in the world. It was my special privilege to get to know him quite well, and it has been another privilege for me to tell you about some of my memories. Thank you for listening.